posing for pictures even before he got to the podium. He couldn't resist this opening line.
Guess who's back? Back again!
The self-styled disruptor, Nigel Farage, says Britain is broken and Reform is the party to fix it.
Nothing actually works anymore. We're broken economically as our national debt explodes. And I'm in absolutely no doubt that we are in decline culturally. So we've chosen to launch our contract with you.
A contract rather than a manifesto, just 25 pages, light on detail but heavy on funding pledges. He promised to cut taxes, cut fuel duty, abolish business rates. But he also pledged to spend a dramatic amount, £141 billion a year. He denied this was akin to Liz Truss's mini-budget.
To compare it to Liz Truss is wrong. Yes, Liz Truss wanted to talk about growth, but nowhere in her proposal could we see cuts on the one hand to compensate for the giveaways on tax. That was the fundamental mistake that Kwasi Kwarteng made with that budget. We're not making that.
Reform's pledges include raising the income tax threshold to £20,000, cutting government spending by £50 billion a year without touching frontline services, ditching net zero and allowing more oil and gas drilling, and freezing non-essential immigration.
In this document, which...
Mr Farage said the numbers had been worked out by the man he replaced as leader, Richard Tice.
He deserves the credit for this, not me.
Nigel Farage said at the end that this was all your work. So if it doesn't add up and if it goes wrong, he's going to blame you.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I mean, you said £50 billion worth of government cuts without touching frontline services. That's not possible, is it?
It's completely possible. You see, that negative defeatist attitude is why public spending has gone up, but the quality of public sector outcomes has gone down.
Mr Farage's arrival on the Gurnos estate caused something of a stir today. It's telling that Reform chose this post-industrial town. Labour's first leader, Keir Hardie, was elected here in Merthyr Tydfil in 1900, and it's been a party stronghold ever since.
This town used to be full of shops and pubs and everything. It's gone to the dogs.
Meryl Morgans used to work in a chocolate factory, her husband down the pits.
The unemployment rate is very, very high, OK? A lot of these kids in Merthyr, I can expect them grown-ups, OK? They want to go to work, but there's no work for them to come to. There's nothing at all. No jobs at all.
Shirley Jones told me she's struggling with her heating bills. She says she feels let down after the promises of Brexit.
What they promise they don't keep. They don't keep their promises.
And do you feel they're all like that?
At the moment, yes.
Nigel Farage said the way to tackle the cost of living crisis, as well as NHS waiting lists and the housing shortage, is by tackling immigration. He promised to freeze what he described as non-essential migration and to stop the boats within 100 days.
We've been out and about in this area. People say they feel let down by Brexit, that you promised a lot of things, it didn't deliver. Aren't you making the same promises now on immigration?
They weren't misled at all. They were told the truth. We're going to be in charge. We can make things better or make things worse, but we are in charge. And the immigration point is actually about population numbers. It's about the population explosion.
But where are you getting those figures? Because are you including people who are leaving?
The population of this country has exploded by 6 million since the Conservatives were in power. And the vast majority of that is directly down to immigration.
And just talk to me about your candidates, because you've had another candidate resign. You've had something like 16 now who have had to go for using offensive language. Why do you think people who feel this way about minorities...
Ordinary folk who put pub talk on their social media and don't have the same senses that people have in inner London speak in a different way.
No, but it's not about inner London, it's not about pub talk, is it?
Oh, it's about working class people.
No, it's not, come on. If it's saying that black people are like baboons,
well,
or Sharia law
I've seen
Muslims...
nothing like that, but there are many things that people say in the pub, on social media. That's how they talk. They might be offensive to some, they might not to others.
But it's not about being offensive to some, is it? Some of it is racism, some of it is Islamophobia,
and where there is, I have a long history of dealing with it.
Mr Farage batted away questions about rejoining the Conservatives. Reform isn't expected to win more than a handful of seats, but he confirmed his ambition is to become Prime Minister by the end of the decade.
And here are all the candidates standing in Merthyr Tydfil and Aberdare. Well, Carl Emerson from the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, which studies UK government taxation and spending, came here to speak to me earlier. And I asked what he makes of Reform UK's position on tax cuts.
They're proposing really quite big tax cuts, some big spending increases, all of which they think can be paid for by some very large cuts to spending. I think the problem is that the tax cuts are probably in reality tens of billions of pounds a year more than they expect. And actually, if, for example, the pledge on the NHS probably likely to cost a lot more than what they expect.
So it doesn't add up?
The numbers look really challenging. I think in practice, if a government tried to implement this package, it would either have to do some, but not as much of it, or it would have to find some tax rises or some additional spending cuts elsewhere to make the numbers work.
So just explain, give me an example of why you think the cuts would actually cost more.
The tax cuts, big cut to income tax, taking people out of basic rate tax, taking people out of higher rate tax. We think that would cost more than Reform expects. The corporation tax cut, they give the average cut per year over the Parliament, but the second part of that cut comes in year 3. So by the end of the Parliament, the tax cut's worth a lot more than they expect.
So you suddenly need to find a lot more money somewhere
You'd need
else.
to find more in, say, year 4 or year 5 of a Parliament if you did try and implement the whole package.
What about their assumptions on growth?
They have some very punchy assumptions, assuming that you get a lot more growth. They actually don't rely on that to make their numbers work. I think in reality, it's not clear that this package of measures would bring about anything like the boost to growth they expect, at least not in the near term.
There's an appeal to sort of common sense with their, cut of 5p in every pound being spent in public money that would save £50 billion. They say, where they say in any business you can say, well, let's take out 5% and you can do it. Can you do that when it comes to government spending?
Well, it's obviously there are some inefficiencies. I think the challenge is you say you're going to take 5% across the board, but I would expect you'd then say, oh, but we want to increase the NHS budget, we want to increase the defence budget, we want to protect the state pension. So all of a sudden you're looking at much more than 10% across the rest of government. And of course, many of those areas are the areas that had really big cuts during the 2010s. Now, you can cut spending in those areas if you want. What you can't do is cut spending and claim it will be painless. It's not all going to come from just waste and inefficiencies. You have to accept some reduction in what the state is actually doing.
And when they say, well, this is just the Westminster Oxbridge elites, telling us that, to patronising us, if you like, saying, we don't know what we're doing, what's the reply?
Well, I can give you a concrete example. They want to eliminate waiting lists in the NHS within 2 years. Now, clearly, it'd obviously be great if there were no waiting lists in the NHS, but the NHS has always had waiting lists. It's never been able to eliminate them. They cost that at £17 billion. It's just obvious it would cost a lot more than that. You can see during the first decade of the 2000s, much, much bigger increases in spending over a 10-year period. Waiting lists came down. They were not eliminated. So I can pretty much guarantee you could not eliminate them within 2 years for £17 billion.
Right, and when you look at their headline tax cuts, where does that place us historically as to where we would be if we implemented their tax cuts?
Well, I think there it's worth noting that, yes, these are big tax cuts and it would be a big, bold manifesto offer, but I think it's worth saying the tax cuts are not unachievable in the sense that they would only put tax as a share of national income around the level we had in 2019, which is another way of saying we've had a really big increase in tax over the last 5 years. Reform will be looking to wind that back over a full Parliament.
Carl Emerson, thank you very much.
Thank you.